Hi there, everyone. We're going to be learning about the story of Daniel in the lion's den today. You see those lions on the back there, aren't those pretty neat? Well, our memory verse is on there, which we'll get to later. But first, for you younger children who might be watching today, I want to read the story about Daniel in the lion's den today. It's by Arch Books and quality religious books for children. And I want to read this story to you about Daniel in the lion's den and what we learn about him through this lesson. So listen closely as I read this to you, okay? Have you heard of Daniel, a brave Jewish man, whom the king of Babylon put into a lion's den? Why was he punished so? And what happened then? Prince Daniel served the king, who liked him so. It made the other princes mad. Let's get rid of him, they said. But isn't it too bad? We cannot say old Daniel does a single thing that's wrong. We'll have to trick him some sly way. We'll watch him all day long. Now, other men in Babylon prayed to a lot of different gods. But Daniel, all the long years through, to our own God was always true. Those jealous men saw Daniel go into his room the next day. They listened on the ground below as Daniel knelt to pray. Aha, they cried, this helps our plan. And to the palace these men ran. O King Darius, Majesty, we are indeed so blessed to have you rule us. Do you know we think you are the best? We need a new law, yes we do, that says we only pray to you. And anyone who disobeys to the lions will be cast before the sun sets that same day. An evil custom of the past. This made the king Darius glow, to think his people loved him so. He signed the law so quick and fast, he did not see it was a trick. But Daniel was a brave old man. He heard the news and saw the plan. Yet still he stopped 3 times a day to give thanks to God and pray. Just watch those heartless men run fast. Your Majesty, we just went past old Daniel's room. We heard him pray to his own God the same old way. He is the first to disobey. The king cried out, not Daniel, he's done no wrong. You know it. But, these men shout, a law is a law, it must be kept, now show it. No help for Daniel. He marched then at sundown to the lion's den. They push him in, the lions roar. The guards clang shut the heavy door. The king's in tears, he's so upset. He spends the night awake. Dear Daniel, oh, if he should die, my heart will break. At dawn, the king then hurries to the lion's den. So worried he can hardly breathe, he shouts, oh, Daniel, tell me, please, could your God save you from the lion's teeth? Yes, Daniel calls. My God, shut tight the lions' mouths all through the night. Please don't be sad. I'm quite all right. The king is overcome with joy. He makes the guards let Daniel free. The wicked men are soon destroyed, thrown into the pit of snarling beasts. Tell all his people far and near, the king sends out this word, now hear. Let us praise the God who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. He works many wonders. He saves and he rescues. The God of Daniel is the king over heaven and earth. My, what a celebration then was held to honor Daniel, this man who faced the lion's den, so sure God could take care of him. Daniel knew that God would take care of him and that it was more important to make that right choice and to continue to pray to God because it contradicted God's the rule that the king had put in place. So Daniel continued in what he was accustomed to doing, and that was praying to God, because that was a more honorable choice in that moment. Will you have courage like Daniel? Will you dare to be a Daniel, as it's been said, when you know that you must trust God and make a choice that's honorable to him above anything else? I hope so. Hi there, welcome to another week of teaching from God's Word. I want to extend my welcome, my warm greeting to you If you're watching for the first time, if you haven't been following along with the studies that we've been doing in the book of Daniel, then I welcome you and I encourage you to go back and watch the rest of these videos, the ones prior to this one, that teach the lessons from the book of Daniel. We are continuing in Daniel chapter 6 today, and so you can find the rest of those videos on our YouTube channel and catch up to where we're at today. That way you are informed on what we've been learning about and what others have been learning about as they've been watching these. If you have been watching these videos, I welcome you back. It's been a fun ride along with you as we learn from the book of Daniel so many truths that are applicable for our lives today, lessons that we ought to be learning from the character of Daniel and God's character in the book of Daniel that is applicable to our lives today. So I encourage you now, grab your copy of God's Word. I have mine right here. I love to read from it, and I'm excited to read from it today, but I want you to have your own copy in front of you so that you know when I read from it, it's not just my words that I'm saying, but it's the words from Scripture. They're God's words to us. So have your copy ready. Go run and get it if you need to now, and then join us back here as we continue this morning. Now, if you have been watching these videos, or now you've caught up and you're back with us now, you'll remember that last time, in our last chapter of Daniel, we learned from Mrs. Lorch that God was sending a serious message to King Belshazzar. You remember at the beginning of Daniel that we learned that the king that was ruling at that time was King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, now many years have gone by, and there's a new king on the throne, and his name is King Belshazzar. And we learned about this last week and how God sent him a serious message warning him, or a message of judgment that was going to come upon him for his disobedience to the Lord. He was not measuring up to God's holy standard. He was not submitting himself to God, and he was a very proud man. And because of his pride, there were consequences. And you learned about this last week, that God holds people accountable for their actions. And today we're going to be learning about how our right choices make a difference, and how Daniel was a faithful man to the Lord, unlike King Belshazzar and others in Babylon who were not submitting themselves to the Lord. They were not following God's standard of living, and they were wicked men, evil men who were not following after the Lord. Now this week we continue on in our story in Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6. And so I'd like you to turn your Bible there as we begin, and we are going to learn about how we can have lion-like courage. And I hope that by the end of our lesson today, you will understand the importance of seeking to honor God in every choice that you make. Think about different choices you make now. And are you seeking to honor God in the choices that you make? You might believe so, and maybe you are in many instances. But I know that there are all things in our lives, situations or areas in our life that we're not willing to honor the Lord in. And we need to confess those areas and to seek God's strength, to seek courage like Daniel did, to honor God in every choice that he made. Now, as we open our story today, I want us to understand that Daniel is a man of courage, and he is just a man like you. He is a human. And so the things that he was able to do, we are able to do as well. And so as we learn about Daniel, don't just think of him as some awesome Bible character, although he is, and he is a wonderful example, but he was a human. And he went through some pretty unique circumstances that we'll learn about today and that you have been learning about. And Daniel's friends being thrown into a fiery furnace, things that we don't experience or have not, or hopefully will never experience. But even those men, Daniel's friends, were just humans who were seeking to be obedient to God. And so understand that the life lessons are applicable to you and I, and as a child, you can still live out the courageous life that Daniel did as well. Now, turn to your Bible, as I said, to Daniel chapter 6. And here we learn an important lesson about honoring God in every choice that we make. You see, King Darius was the new king after proud King Belshazzar was killed. And so we had King Nebuchadnezzar, and then we had King Belshazzar. And now many years have gone by after even that event that we just talked about. And now there's another king on the throne in Babylon. His name is King Darius. King Darius decided to choose 120 rulers to help him rule his entire kingdom. And over those 120 rulers, King Darius chose 3 more important rulers on top of them. And so you had these 3 rulers, and then they were in charge of other people underneath them. Maybe you can think about it in this way. We have a president that rules in the White House. And underneath him are governors in each of the states. Now, it's not exactly like that. There's different people in between all of this. But you know that there's a governor in each state. And they are responsible in some aspects to the president. And underneath these governors, there are mayors in each city. And they are in charge of a collected group of people in each city. And they are responsible to the governor in some aspects. And so maybe this will be a helpful illustration to think about it. So you have your president, in this case it was King Darius, and then you have governors who are in charge of each particular state, and then you have mayors. And so there's just kind of this hierarchy of leadership. And Daniel was acting as one of those governors, quote unquote, along with 2 others as well. King Darius noticed that Daniel always did a better job than the other 2 presidents, or other 2 governors, I should say, in our illustration. Daniel was always loyal, and he was faithful. Daniel was honest and a hard worker. The king liked Daniel very much. Remember, Daniel was not a Babylonian. He did not grow up in Babylon. This was not his home. He was from Israel. Remember back to when Babylon took Jerusalem into captivity and the nation of Israel, and they brought back some of the wisest young men, including Daniel, to be trained to serve in the king's palace. And so that is why Daniel has now been here for so many years. But Daniel is not a Babylonian. He is an Israelite, a man who is from God's chosen people, the nation of Israel. So, as I said, many years have gone by since Daniel first arrived in Babylon. And since then, he has learned the language, and he has grown in his wisdom and understanding of the Babylonian ways, the culture, the language, the sciences, and the literature, all of these things. He had served under King Nebuchadnezzar and King Belshazzar, and now under King Darius. And by this time, Daniel was no longer a young man. He was probably more like the age of maybe one of your grandpas, and or someone older that you know. Perhaps you have an older father. And so he was of this age. He was actually not a teenager at this point in which the story is taking place today. But through all of these years, Daniel never stopped trusting God and being faithful to God. Daniel had never bowed down to an idol or worshipped any other god but the Lord. Remember Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and how they refused to bow down to the golden image of King Nebuchadnezzar? Daniel was the same kind of faithful man. He would not disobey God's command to not make a graven image or some kind of idol, and to not worship any other person but God. Now, in Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, let me read that verse to you now. And this is what Daniel chapter 6, verse 3 says. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So remember, as we said, Daniel is one of those governors underneath King Darius. And because the king respected Daniel so much, he had this idea, maybe I'll put him second in command only to me. So he was a governor, but maybe I'll make him in charge of the governors and over all the governors and those mayors that we talked about. Well, this would be such an honor and a good position for Daniel. After all of his years of faithfulness, this would be a wonderful promotion for Daniel. But not everyone was so happy about this as King Darius was. You see, the other two governors that were like Daniel were very jealous about this. They got wind of this and found out that the king was thinking about doing this for Daniel, promoting him to this very important position. They wanted to be second in command like Daniel, and they didn't want Daniel to get this job. Maybe it would cause them to lose their job and their position, and it certainly wouldn't make them look as important as Daniel would be. They wanted all of this honor for themselves. Those angry, jealous men together decided to plot against Daniel so that he wouldn't get this position. They thought to themselves, you see, if we watch Daniel closely, perhaps we will discover something bad about him. Surely he will slip up and do something dishonest or illegal. Then we can tattle to the king and tell him about this. So these men spied on Daniel day and night. They watched and waited to see where he would slip up. Maybe he would disobey some kind of law that the king had put in place. And if they could catch him in the act, they could go and tell the king and tattle on him and say, look, Daniel isn't this perfect, righteous man that you think he is. He has flaws and he doesn't deserve this position. But you know what? The surprising thing is, perhaps to them, although not to us, as much as they waited and watched him in every area of his life, they couldn't find one single thing to make Daniel look untrustworthy. They saw, in fact, how trustworthy Daniel actually was, like the king saw that he was. And this was infuriating to them. They were like, come on, we need to catch him. But they couldn't find one single thing, not one single thing that Daniel was doing wrong in his life. This isn't working at all, complained these governors as they met with the mayors to try to decide what to do. We can't catch Daniel doing anything wrong. What are we going to do? How are we going to catch him? And how are we going to stop the king from promoting him? We can't just let Daniel get into this position of honor, they said to one another. And so they came up with another idea. And Daniel chapter 6, verse 5 tells us how they were going to plot against Daniel. It says in verse 5, then these men said, we shall not find any charge against Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. The only thing that they could think of and come up with was to try to make Daniel's worship of the one true God a problem. The only way they could come up to devise a plan was if they could cause Daniel to not be able to worship his God. So one of the men said in a crafty way, let's make a law that forces him to disobey his God. And you know Daniel will never disobey his God. You see, they understood after watching him for so long that if Daniel was faced with the choice, the decision of whether he was going to obey some kind of law that the king put in place, or whether he was going to obey God's pre-established law for his life, he was going to choose God's law because they understood that Daniel was a faithful and trustworthy man, not just merely to King Darius, but to his God. He was faithful and trustworthy to God. Yes, they said to one another, these governors and deceiving men, I will write a law and then we will trick King Darius into signing it. Once the law is made, it can't be changed. And once Daniel breaks the law, he will be in such big trouble. And so they devised this awful plan against Daniel. Those wicked, scheming rulers were up to no good. Soon the law was written. They had something written out, and they brought it to King Darius to get his signature. And once King Darius would sign that law, it was in place, and it couldn't be removed. It couldn't be changed. Kind of like the law that we have today. Once it's in place, there's a huge ordeal to try to get it to be changed. And it can't just be thrown out the window whimsically. It has to go through procedure. So the same way with this. Once the king signed this law, nothing could be changed. Everyone had to obey that law. No one could be excluded, not even Daniel. And the rulers who were scheming against Daniel understood this. Well, The crafty rulers bowed low before King Darius and flattered him with their kind words. In Daniel chapter 6, verse 6 and 7, this is what they said to King Darius when they brought the law to them. So these governors and satraps, which were the rulers, thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors of the kingdom and the administrators and satraps, the counselors and the advisors, have consulted together to establish a royal statute or commandment or law, and to make firm a decree that whoever petitions, which means prays, any god or any man for 30 days, except for you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. So they came to him and said, listen, King Darius, we have this wonderful idea that for 30 days, the people can only pray to you. They can only make their petitions to you. To no other god can they pray except to you. Well, to King Darius, this sounded like a wonderful thing. That made King Darius feel so important. He thought to himself, wow, only people praying to me? That seems like a pretty neat thing to think about and to have, knowing that they think of me as so authoritative and so powerful, so important that they would cry out to me in their prayers so I could meet their needs, and that they thought of me as almost a god. Wow, what a privilege that would be. And he liked the idea of that law. And if all the rulers wanted to honor him, then why stop them? Why not put this law intact? So King Darius put his signature on this law, and it went into place. It could not be changed. It was final and done. Well, let me ask you this question. What do you think Daniel thought when he heard about this law? That he could no longer pray to any god, his God, but only to King Darius. What do you think went through through Daniel's mind? Well, this is what Daniel did. We know this after hearing the law. Look at verse 10 of Daniel chapter 6. It says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. So he heard about the rule and the new law, and he understood it, and he went home. And this is what he did after he went home. And in his upper room, with his windows open toward Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day. And this is what he did. He prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. So what did Daniel do? Well, Daniel knew that there was this new law that commanded him not to pray to anyone but King Darius. But he went home and he opened up his windows and prayed toward Jerusalem. That's what the Israelites were commanded to do. And so it says Daniel continued doing this as was custom to him, as it was his normal kind of business and schedule to do. It's like us. Before a meal, you sit down and it's customary for you or your dad or your mom to say a word of thanks to the Lord for the meal, for what God has provided. Or maybe before you go to bed, this is kind of a customary time perhaps for your family to pray together. And Daniel just did just that. As was his custom, he went home and prayed, just like normal. No law, no rule, no scheming rulers would keep Daniel from obeying God. God had said not to bow down to or pray to anyone but the Lord. We know this from Scripture. Daniel knew that if he prayed to King Darius, he would be treating the king like a god. Daniel had decided long ago that he would obey God no matter what. So Daniel knelt by his window and prayed. This was all part of the ruler's wicked plan. They wanted Daniel to go home and pray. They knew he would because Daniel was a faithful man. As soon as they saw Daniel praying to God, they ran to King Darius to tattle on Daniel. If you ever do that, perhaps you can admit you're upset at your sibling, one of your siblings, and they then go and do something that you know they're not supposed to do. Your parents have said perhaps, no playing with your toys until all your chores are done. And you go to your brother's room, and he still hasn't He hasn't cleaned up the living room or dusted or Windexed like your parents have told them to do. And he's there sitting, playing with his toys. He has his door closed so no one knows. And you go and you find Mom and you find Dad. And you say, Mom, Dad, my brother is playing with his toys and he still hasn't finished his chores. Well, that's tattling. And that's what these rulers were doing to Daniel. They had set up this plan where they could catch him, and then they were going to go tell the king about this and whine to him and tell him to do something about it. So this is what we see in verse 12, exactly what they did. And they went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den? They were reminding him of the law that he had just signed. And the king answered and said, the thing is true. He had done this. Well, King Darius was not happy when he found out that Daniel had broken this law. They told the king all about it. They said that Daniel, who is one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, meaning he doesn't honor your command, or he doesn't honor you, but makes his petition 3 times a day, speaking about his prayers to God. Now in verse 14 it says, and the king, King Darius, when he heard these words about Daniel, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of sun to deliver him. King Darius was not happy. First, he was angry with himself. He had allowed himself to be flattered and tricked by these rulers. He was so angry with these rulers, these governors, for devising this rotten plan in the first place. But what could be done about it, thought King Darius. The law was the law. Even a king could not change the law that was in place. All day King Darius thought and thought. Surely there must be some way to save Daniel so that he wouldn't have to cast him into the lion's den. He paced the floor and racked his brain. He scratched his head and sighed. "O king," the rulers said to him, "you know that the penalty for disobeying this law is to be thrown into the lion's den, and that law can't be changed." Finally, King Darius threw his hands in the air in frustration. "Very well. Take Daniel to the lion's den," he said. "I will meet you there." The lion's den was in the ground. There was a small hole at the top covered with a large stone. The lions were ferocious and always hungry. They would eat Daniel and anything that came down into that hole. It certainly looked hopeless for poor Daniel. Well, verse 16 says this about the situation. The king gave the command and they brought Daniel, and this is what they did. They cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, as he threw him in, "Your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you." You see, how interesting. Even King Darius knew that Daniel's God was a powerful God. And that if anyone could help Daniel in this hopeless situation, it would be Daniel's God. Daniel was hurled into the den, and the stone was placed over the hole. The sorrowful king went back to his palace. That night, the king didn't sleep a wink. He didn't want to eat. He didn't even want the musicians to play music to help him fall asleep. He just tossed and turned all night long. Very early the next morning, the king got up and ran to the lion's den and commanded that stone to be removed. What do you think Daniel was thinking after he was thrown into the lion's den? Maybe you know the end of the story, which we're about to get to. But as you know, he was thrown into the lion's den. But what was it like for him all that night as he sat there? What was it like for him to get tossed in and then to hear the growls of the lions? Perhaps it was too dark to see them, but maybe he felt their hot breath pass by as they thumped by. Maybe he heard the pounding of those large beasts, their paws on the ground, as they came over and sniffed Daniel maybe? Do you think Daniel was fearful? You know, we often paint Daniel as a fearless man, a man of bravery and courage. And he was that for sure. We know that from the life of Daniel. But what made Daniel that courageous? What makes him be that fearless person that we talk about him as? Was it because Daniel was some super powerful superhero that could save himself, and that every situation he went into, he's thought, you know, I got this. I can handle this? I know that's not the case. As we said, Daniel was just a human. He was a man like you and I. He wasn't some kind of extra superhuman person. What gave him that courage and bravery? Well, this is what it was. It was Daniel's experience of God's presence and God's hope and strength in the past. Daniel had walked his life along with God. God was with him, present with him, giving him the strength and the courage to make right choices all along through his life. Think back to the first book of Daniel, when Daniel was challenged, faced with the decision of whether he was going to eat the king's food or if he was going to obey God's law regarding certain foods, whether he could eat them or not. That was a tough choice for Daniel from the very beginning, from the get-go. But Daniel understood this, that his relationship was more important with God than it was to this king. It was more important for him to honor God in this situation when it contradicted God's word. And so Daniel had been making these choices all along through his life to be faithful to God and to obey God in small things and in large things. And this gave him the courage for the next time, the bravery for the next time. Even knowing that maybe one of these times God would choose to remove him from this life, maybe he would die. The consequences of obeying God are sometimes drastic. But it was important to Daniel. And so when these bigger choices, these ones that had to do with his life, when his life was on the line, he knew that God would give him the strength, the courage, the bravery to honor God and make the right choice. You see, it wasn't just that Daniel was some superhero. He was super dependent, we could say, upon his God to give him the courage, that wasn't humanly possible to muster up on ourselves, but courage from God, strength from God to honor the Lord. And so the next morning, the king arrived at the lion's den. He wanted to know the fate of Daniel. And they removed the rock from over the hole. And King Darius was absolutely astonished and overjoyed when he called into the den and he said, "Daniel, was your God able to save you from the lions?" He listened to see and to hear if Daniel would reply if he was alive. Daniel called up, "O king, live forever. My God has sent his angels and has shut the lions' mouths. They have not hurt me." All night, Daniel had sat there and not a paw was placed on Daniel. No lion's mouth had destroyed or hurt Daniel. He was alive and well. God had protected him. Once again, God was with Daniel, protecting him in this situation. Well, the king called for his guards to pull David out of the lion's den. What a miracle! There wasn't even a scratch on him. Like Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they were thrown into that fiery furnace, and God was with them there, present, he had protected them from not even a hair being singed. And now not even a tooth of a lion had been laid on Daniel. No bite marks, no scratches, nothing. King Darius was overjoyed and threw his arms around Daniel in joy. And then King Darius became very angry when he remembered how the king's rulers had so deceitfully tricked him into having him have to throw Daniel into the lion's den. Well, what do you think the king did with these rulers that had tricked him? Verse 24 says that he had those rulers and their families thrown into the lion's den, and immediately the lions devoured them. Yikes. What a punishment for their their deceitfulness. Then King Darius made a new law in the land. A great crowd gathered to hear the king read his new law. And this is what it was. In verses 26 and 7, this is what King Darius wrote for the new law and what he said to the people. He said, I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom, men must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. Wow. What an amazing contrast with the law that was in place earlier. Just days before, there was a law that only men in the land, only men in King Darius's kingdom could pray to King Darius. They were required to pray to King Darius if they were going to pray to anyone. And now King Darius in turn has made a new decree that no man can pray to anyone except for the one true living God, Daniel's God. The God that I pray you and I serve today. What a drastic change. And this came from God's hand of protection upon Daniel and the lessons that were learned by King Darius through this situation. Both he learned two lessons. One from God, who is more powerful than anything. He is powerful over his own creation. And King Darius learned this, that not even lions could devour Daniel. God would protect him. But also he learned a valuable lesson from Daniel himself, that Daniel was trustworthy and that Daniel was faithful to his God. And because of Daniel's faithfulness to his God and his obedience to God, God was loving to Daniel and merciful to him and chose to save him from this situation. King Darius learned many good lessons, and we too can learn these lessons as well. That God is powerful. He is more powerful than anything because all that exists is God's creation. And God is the creator is more powerful than the creation. Daniel was a very old man when he was thrown into the lion's den. He had learned over and over again that he could trust God. He knew God loved him and that God cared for him. He knew, most importantly, that obeying God and his word was always the right choice. And he trusted God with the rest. You see, that's an important lesson for us today. Through all of these situations, we see that God protected him, that God protected his physical body from very destructive things like the lions. But you see, Daniel understood that any one of these times, God, again, as we said earlier, could choose to take him from this life. And Daniel would have been a wonderful example, a martyr, as it's sometimes referenced. A martyr for God, meaning he was an example. He was put to death for his faith and obedience to God. And that is a wonderful example of obedience and faithfulness to God. And so Daniel understood that at any time this could happen. But he was entrusting all of that, his physical life, into God's hand. And what he could do, what he could have control over, was the decisions that he made while he was alive. And that was to obey God and his word. And not to pray to King Darius, because King Darius is a man. He's not a god. And only God is deserving of our prayers, our petitions. As the creator, as the God over all things. And therefore, Daniel chose in this decision to make the right choice and to pray to God only. For us, as a kid, or whoever may be listening now, as humans in our time, in our life, we aren't threatened, perhaps, by being thrown into a lion's den for our choices. But Satan will tempt you to sin. That is inevitable as a believer. Others might try to convince you that sin is okay or maybe even fun. Remember, God's way is always best. God is holy and true. What he says is right and good. And standing up for what God says is right is always the best choice. There may be laws, perhaps not now, but in the future, that contradict God's word. And that's the important key there. There are laws now that we must submit to and obey that our government puts into place. And Scripture tells us to submit to our rulers, to our authorities, to a teacher, to a parent, to our governor, to our president. But if they ever ask us to do something that would be contradicting what God's word says is the right thing to do, then we must follow God's word and suffer the consequences from our rulers, whatever it may be. In Daniel's case, it was being thrown into a lion's den. For us, it may look different. But we must make that choice to obey God because that is the right choice always. We can trust God to give us the courage to honor and to obey him. Daniel had that kind of courage. And you know why? Because Daniel was consistently following God, as we said earlier. And each time he made that right choice to obey God and to entrust the rest of what would happen into God's hands, it gave him more courage and more strength and more trust and dependence upon God for that next decision, if it might be bigger or harder decision. He had seen God's consistent love and tender mercies toward him in the past, and he just continued to follow the Lord and trust that God would handle the situation. And God had, and he did in this case, and he will in your life as well. In our story from God's word today in Daniel chapter 6, we learned some important lessons from the life of Daniel in this lesson today about Daniel in the lion's den. Now, it's a wonderful story, a story of courage and strength and trust upon God. But something else that we can learn from this message and this lesson today is about the character of Daniel. You see, when those rulers were trying to catch Daniel in the act of disobeying either God or the king's decrees or laws, remember what happened? They couldn't find one thing that Daniel was doing wrong and that they could have caught Daniel in and told to the king. All the things that Daniel were doing were consistent with what he was supposed to be doing. He was a faithful man. And that kind of they recognized that defined Daniel. Daniel was defined as a man that was trustworthy and faithful to the king, but also to his God. And that's when they recognized, if we're going to catch Daniel in the act, we have to catch him in the act of disobeying something in regards to his love and his obedience to God. And so they had to come up with a new law that would make him disobey his God. And what they figured that was when they made this new law, that Daniel he would choose to obey his God rather than the law, because they recognized this about Daniel. Daniel was a man of character in obedience to his God. And so that's how they used Daniel's faithfulness and obedience to God against him. Well, let me ask you this question. How are you defined today? What characterizes you? To the rulers, what characterized Daniel was his faithfulness to his God. But for others, it might be something different. What characterizes you? When others look at you and perhaps watch you, there are people watching you today, those younger than you. And when you get older, there's going to be those who are younger than you looking up to you. Perhaps a younger sibling, whether you consciously know it or not, is looking up to you in your character and how you pattern your life, the decisions that you make, your choices that you make. And they look up to you and they learn from that. And that's how they define you, is by your character. Well, what characterizes people today? Well, perhaps here you see these money symbols. This perhaps represents riches or lots of money. Some people want to be characterized by how much money they own. It's important to them. And you think of rich people today, perhaps like Bill Gates, who invented Microsoft. He's a rich man, but you might think of other people. They are characterized by their money, by how much money they own. And that defines their life. Whether they think it or not, other people look at them and say, yeah, that's the rich man. That's the guy that owns a lot of money. Some people are characterized by money. Other people are characterized by their power. You see here I have a picture, that's the White House. And who lives in the White House? Do you know? Yeah, the president. The president lives in the White House. You see, some people are characterized by their power, their status, or position. They are in an important place, and many people look up to them and are under their authority. And that's what some people are characterized by, their job or their position or the power that they have as a president or a business owner, whatever it may be. And some people are characterized by this. It's the president, and they are looked up to in that way. There are other things that define or characterize people as well. Can you see this picture here? Yeah, it's a person in their brain there, some gears. Some people are characterized by their knowledge or wisdom and what they know. There are smart people in this world today, and they are inventors, people through history who have invented things, or are teachers, or are professors, or others that are very intelligent. People who run important businesses, or who work perhaps at NASA and are in charge of the satellites or things like that. And they're characterized by their wisdom. You might know people in your school, people your age even, that they're kind of that smart kid, and that's not a bad thing. God has gifted many people with an extraordinary brain to be able to understand things really well. But some people are characterized by this, what they know and how smart they are. Well, there are other things that characterize people as well, and sometimes it's what they own. You see here, it's a really fancy, expensive vehicle. Some people are characterized by the materialistic things that they own, like maybe a really fancy house or a very nice car or nice clothes, and they pride themselves in what they own. And that's how other people look at them, through those eyes of, wow, that's the person that owns the really nice car. Maybe you see it at school someday, that dad who pulls up and has that fancy car, and the kid who wears the really nice clothes. And that's not bad that people own these things, but people are often characterized by what they own. There are other things that characterize people as well, too. And it's perhaps by, again, things they've done in the past, notable things they've done, like the Nobel Peace Prize or other things in the military. There are things that people do to distinguish themselves, and that is how they're characterized. There are famous inventors through history that have invented the vehicles and modes of transportation, or the computer, or the telephone, or discovered some kind of like gravity, or something about our solar system. And these are our inventors, and you might search them or Google them, and they are characterized by the things they accomplished, like the inventions or the things that they discovered about science and so forth. And this is what characterizes them. But you know what? There is one other thing too that people can be characterized by, and that is by their conduct. And you see here this picture, and it might be a little bit hard to see because there's not color, but this is what's known as a geyser. And this specific geyser, which is a stream of water that shoots up, that's what a geyser is, and often hot water, and it comes from underneath the ground and shoots up, and it erupts, kind of like maybe you might think of a volcano, but not as extreme or dangerous. And this one particularly is called Old Faithful. Old Faithful. And why? Do you know why it's called Old Faithful? Well, this geyser is located in Yellowstone National Park in the United States, in California. And the reason it's called Old Faithful is because it erupts, shoots up its water very consistently. Every 45 minutes to 2 hours, it will shoot up and the water into the air. And so if you were to stand there and it would shoot up and you'd wait another 45 minutes or maybe up to 2 hours, it would erupt again and again every 45 minutes to 2 hours. And And that is why it's called Old Faithful, because it faithfully does this every 45 minutes to 2 hours. It's known to be very highly predictable because of this. And it's been this way for many, many years, for almost 2 decades. And this geyser is characterized as being faithful in its name. It's Old Faithful. It's predictable. They know how it's going to act. And this is how Daniel is. Daniel was a very predictable man. He was older and he was faithful. And that was what characterized him, was his faithfulness to God. And perhaps you might think about yourself. What characterizes you? Is it one of these other things like riches? You might be young, might not have a lot of money, but is that maybe how you're wanting to be characterized someday, or by your position? You want a really important job? Or perhaps you aspire to be the next president. And I'm not saying any of these things are bad things. But let me ask you this. What is the most important thing to be characterized as a believer, as a child of God? Well, I can say this assuredly, that the most important thing to be characterized by is your obedience and your faithfulness to God and His Word. In every choice that you make through life, it is most important to be characterized by your faithfulness to God. And that is a testimony to others and a witness of your love for God. So let me ask you this. What characterizes you right now? And will you aspire and ask God to give you the courage and strength and understanding and wisdom to be characterized by your obedience to God's Word? It can start in the very simplest of decisions and choices you make. And it starts with choosing to obey your parents. It begins with your decisions to pray to God consistently and faithfully, because this is pleasing to Him. And then when those bigger decisions come in your life, because of your consistency, because of your faithfulness to God, it will give you the strength to make those bigger, harder, more courageous decisions. And when others look upon you, they are going to hopefully, and they should see you and define you as a person of character and faithfulness to God. How do people characterize you? And how are you going to be characterized in the future now? Will you decide to be characterized by your faithfulness to God? I hope so. Pray and ask God to help you in that today, okay? Our memory verse for today comes from Psalm chapter 9, verse 10. And let me read for you that verse right now. And it says in the New King James Version, "And those who know your name will put their trust in you. For you, Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you." Does that remind you of our character that we talked about today? The man Daniel. Think about his courage and how he sought the Lord, both in the past choices that he had made, but also in his situation today as well in our lesson. You know, I bet when he went home and prayed to the Lord, one of the things he prayed about was this whole law that had been put in place that was demanding him to not pray to his God, to the Lord. And I'm sure in that prayer, there was something about his asking of strength and trust in the Lord to help him through this, to have the courage and faith to continue to seek the Lord in prayer and to trust the Lord about this situation. And you know what? The Lord heard his prayer. Like the Lord hears our prayers today. And that, knowing this, will help us understand that when we are faced with circumstances where we need to make a decision of whether or not we're going to obey the Lord and trust Him and ask for courage for that, He will hear that prayer. And He will not forsake us. And He will be there helping us, give us that strength and that courage all along the way. We need to trust the Lord and pray to Him. If you know Him today as your Savior, you have that ability to go to Him in prayer and put your trust in Him in all of your situations and all your choices, and have courage and hope and comfort knowing that God will hear you.